The rain came without warning that Tuesday, the way it always did in October. Not dramatically, not with thunder or the courtesy of dark clouds rolling in from the hills, but quietly, almost apologetically, as if it hadn't meant to intrude. One moment, the lane outside Mrs. Hartley's bakery was dry and gold with fallen leaves, and the next it was grey and slick, the puddles forming in the familiar dips between the cobblestones that every St. Mary Mead resident knew by heart. It was the kind of rain that kept people indoors with their tea and their curtains half drawn, watching the world outside with that particularly English mixture of comfort and mild suspicion. And so, naturally, everyone saw him arrive. He came on foot, which was the first thing people remarked upon later. No taxi from the station, no private motor car pulling up with luggage strapped to the back. Just a man, walking up the main lane of St. Mary Mead with a single leather satchel held against his side, his hat pulled low against the rain, his coat, good quality, anyone could see that, darkening at the shoulders with wet. He was perhaps 55, perhaps older. It was difficult to say because he carried himself with the kind of stillness that made age irrelevant. Not tall, not short, not handsome in any striking way, but with a face that, once you looked at it, stayed with you. There was something considered about his features, as though every line on his face had been earned deliberately, thought about and accepted. He paused at the corner near the post office, and he looked up and down the lane with the quiet, unhurried attention of a man who was not lost, but was nonetheless taking his time finding what he had come for. Mrs. Elm, sorting letters behind the post office window, watched him for a full 30 seconds before deciding he was nobody she recognized. She would mention this later. How he had stood there in the rain and looked at the village the way you look at something you've only ever seen in a photograph. He walked on. He found Mrs. Plotkin's boarding house without asking anyone for directions. That, too, people would remark upon later. Mrs. Plotkin was a small, capable woman who had been running her boarding house for 19 years with the efficiency of a woman who trusted her instincts and the stubbornness of one who had learned, through hard experience, to read people quickly. She had turned away a commercial traveler last spring on instinct alone, and had felt entirely vindicated when she later heard he'd left unpaid bills in 3 parishes. The stranger stood on her doorstep and removed his hat, and she noticed 2 things immediately. His hands were steady, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the journey. "I'd like a room," he said. 3 nights if you have one available. I'll pay in advance." His voice was quiet, educated. The accent not quite London, not quite anything she could place precisely. One of those voices worn smooth by years of moving through the world. She gave him the room at the back, overlooking the garden. He paid without negotiating. He thanked her with a sincerity that was, she thought afterward, almost old-fashioned. As though courtesy was something he had decided upon years ago and never abandoned, and regardless of what the world had done to him in the meantime. She showed him upstairs herself, which she didn't usually do, and she couldn't afterward entirely explain why she had. He signed the register as Edward Monkton. The name meant nothing to her. By evening, St. Mary Mead knew there was a stranger at Mrs. Plotkin's. This was not gossip in any malicious sense. It was simply the nature of a village that paid attention. Small places are not nosy out of pettiness. They are watchful out of long habit, because in a small place, the arrival of the unfamiliar has always, historically, meant something. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in the window of the copper kettle tea room with her knitting and her second cup of Darjeeling, had learned this long ago. She had lived in St. Mary Mead all her life, and she had come to understand that a village was, at its heart, a kind of living record, of families and feuds and favors, of land exchanged and promises broken, of old names and older grievances. Nothing arrived into such a place without reason, whether the thing that arrived knew its own reason or not. She saw the stranger when he came into the tea room at 6:30. He chose the corner table. the one by the window that looked out not toward the high street, but toward the narrow lane, just visible between the buildings, that wound eventually up toward the old stone gates of Reeves Manor. He ordered tea and a plain supper. He ate without reading, without looking at his watch, without the performance of busyness that people adopt when they are dining alone and feel the need to justify it. He simply sat and ate and looked, so with that same quiet and deliberate attention, toward the lane. Miss Marple did not stare. She never stared. She knitted, and she watched the way a person watches a fire, not at any one thing but at the whole of it, the movement and the light and the occasional unexpected shift. She noticed that he did not look at the manor gates the way a visitor would. A visitor admires or consults a map or calls something to the attention of a companion. This man watched the lane the way you watch something you have been thinking about for a very long time. There was recognition in it, and beneath the recognition, something else. Something that looked to Miss Marple's experienced eye very much like the particular sadness of a man who has made a decision he knows he cannot unmake. He left a generous tip. He walked back to Mrs. Plotkin's in the dark. He came back the next evening. Same table, same quiet supper, same steady gaze toward the lane. Miss Marple was there both evenings. She said nothing to anyone. She drank her tea and worked 3 inches further along the pale blue scarf she was knitting for her nephew Raymond's youngest, and she thought about the things one thinks about when one has lived long enough to recognize the shape of a story before it has properly begun. She thought about 20-year-old things, about how long a secret can sit inside a person before it becomes unbearable, about the difference between a man who comes to a place to take something and a man who comes to a place to give something back. She thought she knew which kind of man Edward Monkton was. By Thursday morning, he was dead, and Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked out at her garden for a long, still moment, and felt, not surprise exactly, but the particular sorrow of having been right about something she had hoped, for once, to be wrong about. Death in a small village is never a private matter. It announces itself the way all significant things do in St. Mary Mead, not with sirens or spectacle, but with a change in the quality of the silence. By 8 o'clock Thursday morning, before Inspector Slack had even finished his breakfast in the next town, before the doctor had properly signed anything, before Mrs. Plotkin had stopped shaking long enough to put the kettle on, the village already knew. Mrs. Plotkin had found him at 7. She brought breakfast to the rooms herself on cold mornings, a habit she'd kept since her husband died, and the house had grown too quiet for her liking. She had knocked twice, which was her custom, and when no answer came, she had assumed he was a heavy sleeper, the way men of a certain age sometimes were, and she had let herself in with her key. He was in the armchair by the window, not in the bed, which she thought afterward was somehow the saddest detail. That he had not even made it to sleep. He was sitting upright, his hands resting open on his knees, his face turned slightly toward the glass, toward the dark garden below and the lane beyond it and whatever lay further still in that direction. His expression was not frightened. It was not contorted in any of the dramatic ways that death sometimes announced itself. He looked, she told people afterward, with the particular helplessness of a woman trying to describe something that had genuinely moved her. He looked as though he had simply stopped, mid-thought, mid-breath, as though something had reached inside him and turned off a lamp. The leather satchel was on the floor beside the chair. Open, empty. Inspector Slack arrived at 9:30, by which time he was already in a poor temper, having been called away from a matter in Downbury that he considered considerably more pressing than an old man dying quietly in a boarding house. He was a large, flat-faced man with the disposition of someone who had been repeatedly interrupted throughout his entire career and had never quite forgiven the world for it. He looked at the body. He looked at the room. He looked at the satchel. "Heart," he said, and with the confidence of a man who had made up his mind before he walked through the door. Dr. Haydock, who had been the village doctor for 30 years and had learned to choose his battles with Inspector Slack, said that it was certainly possible, and that he would of course need to conduct a proper examination, and that there were one or two small things he wished to note. Slack was already writing in his notebook. Natural causes, he said. Man of his age, travelling alone, probably overexerted himself on the walk up from the station. He paused, tapped his pen against the page. Anybody know what he was doing here? Nobody did, or nobody said. The room told very little. His coat hung neatly behind the door. His small travel bag contained the ordinary things: a change of shirt, a razor, a bar of plain soap, a paperback novel with a cracked spine that he had apparently been reading for some time without finishing. There were no letters, no diary, no documents of any kind. The satchel, which Mrs. Plotkin distinctly remembered him carrying on his arrival, holding it close, the way people hold things they're conscious of, contained nothing at all, not even the ghost of a folded paper. The leather inside was worn in the way of something that had held things for years, pressed flat in places, creased at the corners. Whatever had been in it was gone. Slack noted this and dismissed it. People carried empty bags all the time, he said. Commercial travelers, day trippers, all sorts. Dr. Haydock said nothing further, but he looked at the empty satchel for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Miss Marple heard the news from young Polly Manders, who helped at the bakery on Thursday mornings, and had a gift for appearing wherever information was freshest. Polly delivered it with the barely concealed excitement of someone who understood that she was carrying something significant, and Miss Marple received it with the stillness of someone who had been half expecting the delivery. She asked 3 questions. Was the door locked when Mrs. Plotkin found him? Polly didn't know, but thought not. She'd heard Mrs. Plotkin say she used her key, though whether the door had actually been locked was a thing Polly couldn't say for certain. Had anyone seen anyone near the boarding house the previous night? Polly thought old Mr. Gibbons from the cottage opposite might have been up late. He often was, though on account of his back. But she couldn't say if he'd seen anything or if he'd simply been staring at the ceiling again. What had happened to the morning milk? Polly blinked. The milk? Miss Marple smiled gently and said it was nothing important, just a small curiosity, and thank you so much, dear, and please give her love to Polly's mother. She sat for a while after Polly left, her hands resting on her knitting without working it, which was unusual for her. The garden outside her window was November thin, the rose canes bare and dark against the pale stone wall. A robin was sitting on the gatepost doing nothing in particular, which she always found oddly companionable. She thought about the satchel. An empty satchel was, in its way, more interesting than a full one. A full satchel was simply a container. An empty one was a question. It meant either that a man had arrived carrying nothing of significance, which contradicted everything Mrs. Plotkin had observed about how carefully he held it, or that something had been removed, before his death or after it. And then there was the question of when it had been emptied, and by whom, and whether the person who had emptied it was the same person who had ensured it would never need to be filled again. Miss Marple thought about Edward Monkton sitting in the tea-room, watching the lane toward Reeves Manor with that expression she had identified, and she was rarely wrong about expressions, as the particular sadness of a man approaching a decision long delayed. A man carrying documents, she thought. Letters, perhaps, or something older, a signed statement, not a witnessed account of something that had happened 20 years ago and had been sitting in that satchel, or somewhere very like it, ever since. He had come to deliver something. Someone had made certain. He never did. She put on her coat and hat at 10:30, picked up a small jar of damson jam she had put up in September, and walked the 3 minutes to Mrs. Plotkin's boarding house. Not to investigate, you understand. Simply to offer her condolences to a neighbor who had endured a difficult morning. She asked to see the room. Mrs. Plotkin, who was sensible enough to know that Miss Marple asking to see something and Miss Marple merely being curious were not always entirely different things, but who was also badly shaken and grateful for the company, took her upstairs without argument. Now Miss Marple stood in the doorway and looked at the armchair by the window. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the small table beside it, where a half-empty glass of milk sat, still and white and perfectly ordinary. "Did you bring him his milk last night?" she asked Mrs. Plotkin. Mrs. Plotkin shook her head. "I don't do the milk anymore. Stopped last winter. I leave it to whoever delivers." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "I thought so." She did not say anything else. She looked at the glass once more, with an expression that was not satisfaction. Miss Marple never felt satisfaction about such things, but rather the grave, clear-eyed recognition of someone who has just found the first true piece of a very old and very ugly puzzle. There is a particular kind of guilt that small villages are very good at revealing. It is not the dramatic kind, not the guilt that shouts or weeps or confesses in the middle of the night. That sort belongs to novels and courtrooms and the imagination of people who have never actually watched guilt move through a community of people who all know each other's names. Real guilt, the kind that has been living inside a person for a long time, is quieter than that. It expresses itself in small adjustments, a slight stiffening when a certain name is mentioned, a laugh that arrives just a half-second too late, the careful, deliberate way someone asks a question they already know the answer to, because asking it seems safer than the silence that not asking it would create. Miss Marple had been watching guilt move through St. Mary Mead for the better part of 7 decades, so she recognized it the way a gardener recognizes blight. Not always immediately visible, not always dramatic, but unmistakable once you knew what healthy looked like. By Thursday afternoon, she had identified 3 people in whom something was not entirely healthy. She decided to visit all 3, in the natural order of things, with jam. She went to Dorothea Reeves first. Dorothea was 29, the Colonel's niece by his late wife's side, and she had lived at Reeves Manor for the past 4 years, in that particular arrangement common to families of diminishing fortune. Not quite a guest, not quite a dependent, performing the role of companion and household manager with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned to make themselves useful as a form of self-protection. She was a handsome young woman in the way that goes unnoticed in small villages, where handsomeness in a woman without money or position tends to be treated as a mild inconvenience rather than an asset. She had her aunt's dark eyes. The late Mrs. Reeves had been a striking woman by all accounts, and a way of holding herself very still that Miss Marple had always found interesting. She found Dorothea in the garden, which was unexpected on a cold Thursday morning, and which immediately told Miss Marple something. The girl was standing near the old stone fireplace at the far end of the kitchen garden, a thing left over from some earlier, more practical era of the manor's history, used now for burning garden waste in autumn. The fire had been lit recently. Not recently enough to still be burning, no, but recently enough that the ash was not yet cold, and recently enough that the faint smell of something other than leaves and garden cuttings, something with the particular sweetness of paper burning, still hung in the damp air. Dorothea turned when she heard the garden gate, and Miss Marple saw it. Just for a moment, just a flicker across the composed and pleasant face. The unmistakable expression of someone who has been caught not doing something wrong, exactly, but doing something they would prefer not to have witnessed. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by a warm smile and a perfectly natural greeting. "Miss Marple, how lovely. Do come in. It's bitter out here." They sat in the front parlor and drank the tea Dorothea made with just slightly too much cheerfulness, as Miss Marple offered the jam and asked after the Colonel's health, and Dorothea said he was well, really, considering, a little tired, perhaps. The autumn always affected him. And they talked about the village and the weather and the unfortunate business at Mrs. Plotkin's, which Dorothea said was terribly sad, really. A man dying alone like that, far from home, and did Miss Marple know anything about him? She asked it carefully. Not carelessly. Carefully. Which was the tell? Not very much, said Miss Marple pleasantly. Did you? Oh, no, said Dorothea. No, I'd never seen him before in my life. She lifted her teacup as she said it, and Miss Marple noticed that her hand was perfectly steady, and that the steadiness was the kind that requires a small, invisible effort. She stayed 20 minutes. She left the jam, and she walked back down the manor lane, thinking about the smell of burning paper and the precise way a person says never when they mean something considerably more complicated. Mr. Croft occupied a set of rooms above the solicitor's office on the High Street, an arrangement that had always struck Miss Marple as slightly melancholy, as though the man lived not above a home, but above his function. He was 51, thin in the way of men who forget to eat when they are worried, with the careful, slightly faded manner of someone who had spent 30 years being the second most important person in every room and had made a kind of peace with it. He was ill, people said. Had taken to his bed Wednesday evening. Not available to visitors. Miss Marple did not go to the door, so she went instead to the side window, the one that looked onto the narrow alley, the one Mr. Croft always left open a crack regardless of weather because he was an inveterate pipe smoker, and Mrs. Croft, before she left him 3 years ago, had impressed upon him with great force that he was not to smoke indoors. Old habits. She stood in the alley and called up quietly that she hoped he was feeling better and that she had left some damson jam with the downstairs girl, and that she was sorry to hear he was unwell. There was a silence. Then the curtain moved. "Thank you, Miss Marple," said Mr. Croft, from behind the glass, in the voice of a man who has not slept. "Is there anything you need?" she asked. Another silence, longer this time. "No," he said. "No, and I don't think there's anything to be done now." It was a strange thing to say to an offer of help. Miss Marple noted it with the careful, unshowy attention she brought to all strange things, and she said good night and walked away, and thought about what it meant when a man said now, that particular word in that particular tone, as though something had already passed its moment, as though a door had closed that might, at another time, have been open. Mrs. Elm was the easiest and the most difficult. Easiest because the post office gave Miss Marple a perfectly natural reason to be there. Difficult because Mrs. Elm was a shrewd woman who had been at the center of St. Mary Mead's information for 22 years and was not, under ordinary circumstances, easy to read. She was a large, a composed woman with a face like a well-kept ledger, everything in its place, nothing immediately revealing. She had been postmistress since before half the village had been born, and she approached human nature with the same organized pragmatism she applied to the sorting of post. Miss Marple bought stamps. She mentioned the stranger. She watched, and there it was. The smallest thing, the kind of thing that would have meant nothing to anyone who wasn't specifically watching for it. Mrs. Elm's eyes moved, just briefly, to the pigeonhole in the upper left corner of the sorting rack behind her. The pigeonhole where undelivered letters waited. It was a reflex, involuntary, the kind of movement the body makes when the mind mentions something it is trying not to think about. She recovered instantly. So she talked about the stranger with the appropriate level of village concern, and she was helpful and warm and entirely composed. But her eyes had moved, and Miss Marple, who noticed everything and forgot nothing, had seen exactly which pigeonhole they had moved to. She walked home in the early dark, her mind turning quietly over what she had gathered. 3 people, 3 different kinds of unease. A burned document, an insomniac clerk, and an undelivered letter sitting in a post office pigeonhole. Separately, they were merely curious. Together, they were beginning to form the outline of something she recognized. Not a story, not yet, but the shape of one, the way you can see the shape of a figure through frosted glass. Not the details, not the face, but the undeniable fact of a human presence on the other side. Someone in street. Mary Mead had known who Edward Monkton was, and knowing had been enough to kill him. There is something almost sacred about a letter. Not the email, not the telephone call, not the message passed through a third party with the edges worn off by retelling, but a letter. A thing written by hand, sealed by hand, carried across distance by strangers, and delivered into the hands of the one person in the world it was meant for. There is an intimacy to it that no other form of communication has ever quite replaced, and Miss Marple, who had been writing and receiving letters for the better part of 8 decades, understood this with the particular depth of someone for whom the understanding was not sentimental, but practical. A letter is a commitment. It is evidence. It exists in the physical world in a way that spoken words do not, and it can be kept and produced and read aloud in rooms its writer never imagined entering. This was, she suspected, precisely why someone had wanted very much to make sure that 2 particular letters never reached their intended recipients. She thought about this on Friday morning, sitting at her kitchen table with her second cup of tea, and the quiet industry of a woman who does her best thinking when her hands are occupied. She was shelling the last of the autumn beans, a small, meditative task, and she was thinking about Mrs. Elm's eyes moving to that upper left pigeonhole with the involuntary honesty of a body that had not yet received the instruction to lie. The question was not whether Mrs. Elm had kept the letters. Miss Marple was fairly certain she had. The question was whether Mrs. Elm had kept them out of guilt, out of fear, or out of something more complicated than either. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. She went to the post office at 10:30, when she knew from long experience that the Thursday sorting would be done and the Friday rush not yet begun, and that Mrs. Elm would be alone behind the counter with her ledger and her organized pragmatism and whatever it was she had been carrying since Wednesday night. She did not bring jam this time. She had thought about it and decided against it. Jam was for softening. What she needed this morning was clarity, and clarity, in her experience, was better approached directly. Not bluntly, never bluntly, but without the cushioning of pretense. The bell above the door announced her. Mrs. Elm looked up from her ledger, and for just a fraction of a second, less than a second really, and barely the length of a breath, her face did something complicated before it settled back into its usual composed efficiency. "Miss Marple, what can I do for you?" "I think," said Miss Marple, settling herself comfortably in front of the counter with the unhurried ease of a woman who had nowhere else to be, "that you might be able to do quite a lot, actually, for yourself primarily, but also, perhaps, for the right order of things." Mrs. Elm set down her pen. She looked at Miss Marple for a long moment, the look of a woman taking careful measure, calculating something, weighing one kind of risk against another. 22 years of being at the center of a village's information had given her a very accurate sense of what could and could not be concealed, and from whom. "You noticed," she said finally. It was not a question. "So the pigeonhole," said Miss Marple. "Yes." Mrs. Elm was quiet for a moment. Then she reached beneath the counter, not to the pigeonhole, which was behind her, but to a smaller drawer below the register, the kind with a small lock that she opened with a key she wore on a thin chain at her wrist. She placed 2 envelopes on the counter between them. Both were addressed in the same hand, a careful, deliberate script, the handwriting of someone who had learned penmanship in an era when it was considered a matter of character. One was addressed to Colonel Reeves, the other to a name Miss Marple did not recognize. A Miss Clara Fenn with an address in Exeter. Both had been sent from a post office in London, postmarked Monday. They would have arrived in St. Mary Mead on Wednesday at the latest. "He sent them before he came," said Miss Marple. Not a question either. "Yes." Mrs. Elm sat down on her stool, heavily, like a woman putting down something she had been holding at arm's length for too long. He must have posted them on his way to the station, wanted to make sure they arrived when he did, I imagine. Or just after. "But they didn't arrive," said Miss Marple. "They arrived Wednesday morning." Mrs. Elm's voice was even, controlled. But beneath the control was something that had the texture of shame, and Miss Marple, who did not believe in unnecessary cruelty, let the silence sit without filling it. "I sorted them myself. I recognize the Colonel's name, of course. We all know the Manners Post. The other one I didn't know, but the handwriting was the same, both from the same sender." She stopped. "And someone asked you not to deliver them," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Elm closed her eyes briefly. "Opened them." "Not asked, not exactly." She folded her hands on the counter in front of her, a gesture that was almost formal, as though she were giving testimony, which Miss Marple reflected, in a sense, she was. "Dorothea Reeves came in Tuesday afternoon. She'd seen him, the stranger, walking up the lane. She didn't say she knew who he was, but she was frightened. I could see it. I've known that girl since she was 8 years old, and I've never seen her frightened like that." "What did she say?" "She said that if any letters came for the manor in the next few days, she would appreciate it if I held them. Just for a day or two. Just until she'd had a chance to speak to her uncle about a private family matter." Mrs. Elm's voice tightened slightly on the last 3 words, the way a voice tightens around something it doesn't entirely believe. She said the Colonel's heart wasn't strong, and that unexpected correspondence sometimes distressed him. And you agreed. I shouldn't have. It came out simply, without excuse, and Miss Marple respected her for it. I knew it wasn't right. A postmistress doesn't hold mail on the request of a third party, regardless of the reason. I've known that since my first week in this position. She looked down at the 2 envelopes. But I've also known Dorothea Reeves since she was a child, and she looked at me with a terror I didn't understand, and I told myself it was only for a day, only until things became clearer. "And then he died," said Miss Marple. "And then he died." Mrs. Elm's voice was very quiet now, and I understood that whatever was in those letters, someone had not wanted them delivered, and that holding them had perhaps... She stopped. Could not finish the sentence. Miss Marple reached across the counter and touched the woman's folded hands, briefly, gently. "You didn't know," she said. "You made a wrong decision, which is a very different thing from a wicked one. The people who arrange for wrong decisions to be made carry the greater responsibility." Mrs. Elm looked at her with the eyes of someone being offered a kindness they are not certain they have earned. "May I?" said Miss Marple, indicating the letters. Mrs. Elm nodded. Miss Marple did not open them. Not yet. Not here. She placed them carefully in her coat pocket against her chest, where they sat with the particular weight of things that have been waiting a long time to be known. I shall need to speak to Inspector Slack," she said, rising. "And I think, Mrs. Elm, that when the time comes, and it will come, you should tell him exactly what you've told me, all of it. The truth, in my experience, is considerably lighter to carry than the alternative." She left the post office and stood for a moment on the pavement outside, her hand resting against her coat pocket, feeling the faint rectangular solidity of the 2 envelopes beneath the wool. Edward Monkton had posted these letters, knowing, perhaps, that what he carried in his satchel might not be enough. A backup, then, a safeguard, the act of a cautious man, or a frightened one, making certain that what he knew would survive him if he did not. He had been right to be cautious. He had not been cautious enough. Then Miss Marple walked home through the pale November morning, and that evening, by the light of her reading lamp, she opened the letters and read, for the first time, the full shape of what Edward Monkton had come to St. Mary Mead to confess. The letters were not long. That was the first thing Miss Marple noticed. She had expected, given the weight of what they apparently contained, given that a man had travelled across England and died in an armchair to deliver their substance, something more voluminous. Pages, perhaps. Legal language, dense and careful and exhausting. The accumulated documentation of a 20-year silence finally breaking open. Instead, each letter was a single sheet, written in that same deliberate hand she had recognized from the envelopes, but with a quality she had not expected. Not the careful formality of a legal statement, but the plain, unadorned directness of a man who had rehearsed what he needed to say so many times, across so many years, that all the unnecessary words had simply fallen away. What remained was the truth, stripped to its bones, and bones, as Miss Marple had long observed, were frequently more disturbing than flesh. She read Colonel Reeves' letter first. Dear Colonel Reeves, my name is Edward Monkton. You will not know it. I was, 20 years ago, a junior clerk in the office of your late brother, Gerald's solicitor, Mr. Aubrey Pennick of Pennick and Hale, Exeter. I left that position in the autumn of the same year your brother died, under circumstances I am only now, at the end of my life, prepared to account for fully. And I'm writing to tell you that the will under which your brother's estate was settled in October of 1934 was not the will your brother made. Gerald Reeves made a valid will in the August of that year, 3 months before his death. I witnessed it myself, alongside Mr. Pennick. In that will, your brother left the entirety of his estate, the house in Exeter, the income from the Dorset properties and the sum held in trust, to his daughter, Clara. That will was destroyed. A second document was prepared, witnessed under circumstances I'm ashamed to describe, and submitted for probate in its place. Under that second document, the estate passed in full to your brother's wife, your sister-in-law, Mrs. Agnes Reeves, with no provision for Clara whatsoever. Clara was 11 years old. I knew what had been done. I said nothing until I was 23, and I was afraid, and I told myself the lies that frightened young men tell themselves, that it was not my business, that I had not been the architect of it, that someone else would eventually set it right. No one did. I've been attempting for 20 years to find Clara Fenn. She took her mother's name after Agnes Reeves turned her out of the house within the year, in order to give her the only thing I still have to give, which is the truth and my testimony. I believe I have finally found her. I am writing to you because you deserve to know what was done in your family's name, and because Clara will need, I think, someone on her side when this comes to light. I intend to come to St. Mary Mead on Tuesday. I have certain documents, copies I made at the time, at great personal risk, because some part of me even then understood I might need them one day, which I will bring with me. I hope we may speak. I'm sorry it has taken me this long. I have no excuse that would satisfy either of us. Edward Monkton. Miss Marple set the letter down on her reading table and sat with it for a moment. Outside, the village was quiet. A fox had been moving through the garden earlier. She had heard it, that strange bark they made in the dark. And now there was only the wind in the bare branches of the apple tree and the faint tick of the mantel clock. She thought about Gerald Reeves, whom she had known slightly. A quiet, thoughtful man, younger than the Colonel by several years, with his mother's gentle manner and a fondness for roses. He had died of pneumonia in the November of 1934, quite suddenly, as pneumonia in those days sometimes took people. He had left behind a wife and a daughter of 11, and the wife had moved away within the year, and the daughter had disappeared into the ordinary vastness of England, and the Colonel had inherited the manor from his own father some years later and known nothing, apparently, of any of this. Or had he? Miss Marple held that question up carefully, the way you hold a piece of glass to the light to check for cracks, and decided, provisionally, with the caution she always applied to conclusions reached too quickly, that no, the Colonel had not known. The letter was addressed to him as to a man being informed of something, not confronted with something, and the Colonel was 81 and unwell and whatever else he was. She had known him for 40 years and could not make herself believe he was the kind of man who arranged for witnesses to be poisoned. She opened the second letter. It was addressed to Clara Fenn, and she read it with the consciousness that she was reading something not meant for her eyes. A consciousness she did not let stop her, because the situation had moved well past the point where ordinary courtesies applied. It was, if anything, even simpler than the first. Monkton told Clara who he was, what he had witnessed, what had been done, and what he now possessed. He told her that he was coming to St. Mary Mead to speak first with the colonel, whom he hoped might be an ally. He told her that copies of the original will, the real will, the one made in August 1934, were in his possession, along with a signed statement from a second witness, now elderly but still living, who had been persuaded at last to put her name to the truth. He told her he was sorry. Again, without excuse, just the bare words, set down plainly, the way a man sets something heavy on a table when his arms will no longer hold it. He told her that, whatever happened, she should know that her father had not forgotten her. Gerald Reeves had thought of his daughter first. It was other people who had decided she did not matter. Miss Marple folded this letter very carefully and held it in her hands for a moment before placing it with the first. She thought about Clara Fenn, somewhere in Exeter, not yet knowing that the man who had been carrying her inheritance in a leather satchel for 20 years was dead in a boarding house in a village she had probably never heard of. She thought about who, in St. Mary Mead, had known enough about all of this to be frightened by the arrival of Edward Monkton. And here was the thing that had been sitting quietly at the back of her mind since Thursday morning, waiting for enough information to make itself fully visible. Agnes Reeves, Gerald's wife, the woman who had benefited from the forged will, had died in 1947. She was beyond any legal consequence, beyond any confrontation, beyond anything except the judgment of whatever authority one believed in for such matters. But Agnes Reeves had not acted alone. Mr. Pennock, the solicitor, was also dead. She had checked, a quiet inquiry, of the kind she was good at, conducted through the useful network of correspondence she maintained with people in various parts of England, who found her letters worth answering. Pennock had died in 1951. The second witness Monkton had mentioned, the elderly woman who had finally agreed to sign a statement, was alive, in Exeter. But there was a fourth person. Someone Monkton had not named in either letter, perhaps because he did not know, or perhaps because he had not yet understood the full shape of what had been constructed 20 years ago. Because Agnes Reeves had needed help. She had needed someone who understood the Reeves family, who knew which strings to pull, who could manage the thing from the inside and make certain it held. Someone who had been part of that family's life in 1934. Someone who was still part of it now. Miss Marple sat for a long time in her reading chair, the 2 letters in her lap and the mantel clock ticking its patient way through the night, and she thought about Dorothea Reeves burning something in the garden fireplace on the night Edward Monkton died. Not Agnes's papers. Agnes was dead, and her papers would have been settled long ago. Someone had given Dorothea those papers to keep. Someone who had trusted her with them. Someone who had perhaps told her only part of the story. Enough to make her afraid, not enough to make her understand what she was protecting. Miss Marple looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She would sleep. There was more to understand before she moved, and she had learned, at considerable personal cost in her younger years, that understanding and moving were best not confused with each other. But in the morning, she thought she would pay a visit to Colonel Reeves. It was time at last to ask him what he actually knew about the autumn of 1934. Reeves Manor in November had the particular atmosphere of a house that had once been full and was now learning, room by room, to be otherwise. Miss Marple had known it in better times. In the years when the Colonel's wife Eleanor was alive, and the house had that quality of inhabited warmth that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the presence of someone who genuinely loves a place. Eleanor Reeves had loved the manor the way some women love old things. Not because they are grand, but because they are continuous, because they connect the present to something longer than a single lifetime. She had kept the gardens herself, mostly. She had known every room's history. She had died 6 years ago, and the manor had been quietly diminishing ever since, the way places do when the person who held them together is no longer there to do the holding. Dorothea managed it competently. But competence and love are not the same thing, and the house, Miss Marple thought, as she walked up the gravel drive on Saturday morning, knew the difference. She had telephoned ahead, which was not her usual practice, but seemed, given the nature of what she was carrying, the courteous thing to do. She had spoken to Dorothea, who had been careful and pleasant in the way of someone who has spent the night deciding how to be careful and pleasant, and who had said yes. Of course, the Colonel would be happy to see Miss Marple. He always enjoyed her visits. She would let him know, and there had been a pause before the yes. Not long, but present. The Colonel was in his study, which was the room Miss Marple would have predicted. A small, book-lined space at the back of the house that smelled of old paper and the ghost of pipe tobacco and the particular mineral cold of stone walls that the central heating never quite reached. He was in the high-backed chair behind his desk, wrapped in a wool cardigan that had seen better decades, and he looked, she thought, smaller than the last time she'd seen him. Not thinner, exactly. Smaller in the way that very old people sometimes become, as though the self is gradually drawing inward, concentrating itself in preparation for a departure that is no longer entirely hypothetical. He was 81. He had fought in one war and lived through 2. He had buried a wife and a brother and more friends than he could count without distressing himself. What was left was a man of considerable dignity and, Miss Marple had always suspected, more intelligence than he generally chose to display. Jane, he said, which was what he had called her since 1962, and which she had never corrected because she rather liked it. Sit down. Dorothea said you wanted to talk about something serious. I'm afraid so, said Miss Marple, settling herself in the chair across the desk. I want to talk about your brother Gerald. Something moved across the Colonel's face. Not surprise. Not quite. Something more like the expression of a man who has been waiting for a very long time for a particular knock at a particular door, and has now heard it, and finds that the hearing of it is both worse and better than the waiting. He said nothing for a moment. Then, the man at Plotkin's. Yes, said Miss Marple. His name was Edward Monkton. He was a clerk in Mr. Pennock's office in 1934. I know who he was, said the Colonel quietly. Miss Marple looked at him with the careful, unsurprised attention she brought to revelations. Then you received a letter. No. He shook his head slowly. No letter. But I knew he was coming. Dorothea told me. She'd seen him arrive, recognized him somehow, or rather recognized the significance of him. She'd heard things over the years, things Agnes let slip near the end. He paused. Agnes and Dorothea were close. Closer than I knew, perhaps, or than I wished to know. Agnes told Dorothea about the will. Not all of it. Enough. The Colonel's hands, resting on the desk before him, were very still. Large, weathered hands, the hands of a man who had spent his life doing physical things. Soldiering, gardening, the practical management of a rural estate. Agnes told her that there had been a document, that someone might one day come looking for it, that if they did, Dorothea should handle it. He stopped. The word handle sat between them with an ugliness that neither of them remarked upon directly. And you, said Miss Marple. When did you know? The Colonel was quiet for so long that the clock on the mantel behind him marked the silence with 3 unhurried ticks before he answered. I suspected, he said at last. In 1935. Gerald's solicitor, Pennick, handled everything very quickly, faster than seemed natural. Agnes moved away before the year was out, took Clara with her, then sent Clara away to her own mother's people within months. I asked questions. I was told the will was clear and properly probated, and that the estate was settled. He paused. I was a soldier. I understood orders, and I understood institutions, and I believed, because I needed to believe, that such things were properly overseen, that they could not simply be. He stopped again. Arranged, said Miss Marple gently. Yes, the word came out with considerable difficulty. I told myself I was wrong. I told myself Gerald had that perhaps he and I were not as close as I had imagined, that perhaps he had reasons for the decisions he made. I told myself Clara would be provided for. His jaw tightened. I did not look for Clara. The shame in the room was quiet and specific and had, Miss Marple suspected. I'd been living in this study for approximately 20 years. I should have looked for Clara, he said. Yes, said Miss Marple, because she believed in honesty and because false comfort given to an intelligent person is a form of condescension. You should have. But you didn't destroy the will, and you didn't forge it, and you didn't poison Edward Monkton. The Colonel looked at her sharply. Poison. The milk beside his chair. I believe it was poisoned. Dr. Haydock has been persuaded to look more carefully, and I expect we shall have confirmation shortly. She said it plainly, without drama. Someone in this village administered it. Someone who knew what Monkton was carrying and could not allow him to deliver it. The Colonel's face had gone very still. The stillness of a man working through an implication he does not want to reach. And Dorothea, he said. Not a question. The word of a man arriving at something he has been circling for 2 days without letting himself land. She burned papers the night he died, said Miss Marple. Documents, I believe, that Agnes had entrusted to her. The copies Monkton carried in his satchel were taken. The satchel was empty when Mrs. Plotkin found him, but Monkton was a careful man. She reached into her coat and placed the 2 letters on the desk between them. He had already posted these before he arrived. They were intercepted at the post office, but I have them now. The Colonel looked at the letters. He did not touch them. He also had a second witness, said Miss Marple. An elderly woman in Exeter who has already signed a statement. Whatever was burned in your garden, Colonel, the truth is not gone. It was never entirely in those papers. The Colonel closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet, which he did not attempt to disguise. Clara, he said quietly. Is she? She is alive, in Exeter. She is 49 years old, and she does not yet know any of this, but she will. Miss Marple paused. She will also need to know that her father remembered her, that the will he made was made with her in his heart. That must be said to her by someone. By me, said the Colonel. It was not a question either. It was a decision made in the way that very old men make decisions when they understand that time for making them is running short. Yes, said Miss Marple. By you. She rose to leave, and then paused at the door, because there was one more thing, and it could not be left unasked. Dorothea, she said, turning back. Did she know, do you think, what she was protecting? The full extent of it? The Colonel was silent for a moment. I don't know, he said honestly. I've been asking myself that since Thursday morning. So have I, said Miss Marple. I think we shall need to ask her. She left him sitting in his study with the 2 letters on the desk before him, unopened, and the morning light coming through the old stone window, and the manor quiet around him in the way of a house that has been holding a secret so long it has forgotten what it felt like not to. Rain came again on Saturday evening. Not the apologetic, accidental rain of that first Tuesday when Edward Monkton had walked up the lane with his satchel and his burden and his tired, decided face. This rain was different, heavier, more deliberate, You're the kind that arrives in November with the full intention of staying, drumming against window panes and turning the village lanes into shallow rivers and reminding everyone that the season has shifted permanently into something darker and more honest than what came before. Miss Marple had always felt that weather, properly attended to, had a way of arriving on time. She put on her coat and a hat and her stoutest shoes, took her umbrella from the stand by the door, and walked to Reeves Manor in the rain. She had telephoned ahead this time, as she had done the previous morning, but she had not spoken to Dorothea. She had spoken to the Colonel, and she had said only that she needed one more conversation, and that it would be better if he were present, and that it should happen tonight rather than tomorrow. The Colonel, who had spent the day with 2 letters on his desk and 20 years of suspected guilt rearranging itself into confirmed knowledge, had said yes without hesitation. There was in him, Miss Marple thought, a man who had been waiting to stop pretending for a very long time. The manor lights were warm in the wet dark as she came up the drive. Dorothea opened the door herself. She looked, Miss Marple thought, like someone who had not slept since Thursday, which was probably accurate, but who had used the sleeplessness productively in the way that certain kinds of people do when they are frightened. Not productively in any practical sense, productively in the internal sense. It was as though the hours of wakefulness had been spent on a kind of reckoning that is exhausting and necessary, and leaves a person changed in ways that don't yet show on the surface, but are present underneath, the way frost is present in ground that still looks merely damp. She was composed, but it was the composition of someone who has made a decision, not the composition of someone who is still maintaining a pretense. There is a difference, and Miss Marple felt it the moment their eyes met in the doorway. "Come in," said Dorothea. "He's in the study." The Colonel was standing when they entered, which surprised Miss Marple slightly. He rarely stood for extended periods now. The arthritis made it effortful, but she understood it immediately. He was not standing out of formality. He was standing because sitting felt, tonight, inadequate. Say some conversations require a person to be upright. The 2 letters were still on his desk. He had opened them. Miss Marple could see from across the room that he had read them many times. The paper had the soft, slightly worn quality of sheets handled repeatedly, folded and unfolded in the way you handle something you need to keep returning to, because the mind keeps refusing to fully absorb it. Dorothea sat in the chair across from the desk without being asked. She folded her hands in her lap in a gesture Miss Marple recognized from the post office. From Mrs. Elm, the gesture of someone preparing to give testimony, to say the true thing at last, whatever the cost of it. Miss Marple sat to one side, slightly back, in the way she always positioned herself when she needed to observe rather than direct. And she was not the center of this conversation. She was its architect, but the conversation itself belonged to the 2 people in this room who had been circling each other for 3 days across the wreckage of a secret that was not, strictly speaking, either of theirs. "Dorothea," said the Colonel. His voice was very steady. "I want you to tell me everything. Not what you think I can manage. Everything." Dorothea looked at him for a moment. Then she began. She had been 17 when Agnes first spoke to her about the will. Not the full story. Not then. Agnes was not a woman who gave information away completely or immediately. She operated, as Miss Marple had long suspected from the fragments she'd accumulated, in partial disclosures. Enough to bind a person, not enough to fully implicate herself. She had told 17-year-old Dorothea that there were papers in a box, that the papers were private family matters, that if anyone ever came asking about the Reeves estate, Dorothea was to bring her the papers immediately and tell no one. She had framed it as trust, as intimacy, as the passing of a confidence between 2 women in a family where women needed to look after each other because no one else reliably would. And Dorothea, who was 17 and had no mother, and who had found in Agnes a kind of sharp, unsentimental affection that felt, in the absence of anything warmer, like enough. Dorothea had said yes. She had carried that box through 3 house moves over 12 years. She had not opened it until Agnes was dying. "She told me then," said Dorothea. Her voice was level. She was not crying, yet which Miss Marple thought was not composure, but something beyond it. The place past tears where the truth becomes simply the truth, requiring neither decoration nor apology. "She told me about Pennock, about the will. She told me it had been that the document submitted for probate was not the original." She paused. She didn't say forged. She said altered, as though the word mattered. "It mattered to her," said the Colonel quietly. "Yes, she made it sound like something that had been forced upon her, like Gerald had been going to leave her destitute and she had simply corrected an injustice." Dorothea stopped. She didn't mention Clara. The name landed in the room with the particular weight of a name that has been absent for too long from a conversation in which it should always have been central. "She spoke about money," Dorothea continued, "about the house in Exeter, the properties, the trust, about Pennock and what he'd done and what it had cost her to secure his cooperation. She spoke about it entirely as a financial transaction, a survival." She looked down at her hands. "I believed her because I had known her for 12 years and because she was dying and because I was afraid of what the papers contained, and it was easier to believe her version than to open the box and read them myself." "But you did read them," said Miss Marple. "Eventually. When Monkton arrived." Dorothea nodded. "When I saw him come up the lane on Tuesday. I didn't know his name, I didn't know precisely who he was, but I knew from the way he looked at the manor that he was connected to it somehow. Agnes had warned me, years ago, that someone might come, that the solicitor's office had had a junior clerk who had seen things he shouldn't. She said if he ever appeared, I was to contact her immediately, but Agnes was dead, and I had no one to contact, and I had a box of papers and no understanding of what they actually said." She looked up at the Colonel. "I read them that night. Tuesday night after I'd seen him at Mrs. Plotkin's. I'd walked past and seen the light in his window, and I went home and I opened the box for the first time and I read everything." "And then you understood," said Miss Marple. "I understood what had been done." Dorothea's voice, for the first time, showed a fissure. Small, quickly controlled, but present. "I understood that Agnes had forged a will, that she had done it with Pennock's help and with the cooperation of someone else. A witness I didn't recognize, and a woman's name. I understood that there had been a real will, and that it had given everything to someone called Clara, and that Clara was—" She stopped. "Gerald's daughter," said the Colonel. His voice was barely above a breath. "Gerald's daughter," said Dorothea. 11 years old." She closed her eyes briefly. "Agnes had never once mentioned her to me. Not in 12 years. In Agnes's version of events, Clara did not exist." The silence in the study was dense and specific, and had the quality of something that has been compressed for a very long time finally being given room. "I burned the papers Wednesday night," said Dorothea. "I know what I did, and I'm not going to call it anything other than what it was." She looked at Miss Marple with the directness of someone who has decided that clarity is the only form of dignity left available to her. "I burned them because I was frightened, and because I had been carrying Agnes's secret for 12 years and didn't know how to put it down, and because I told myself, that if the papers were gone, the past was gone with them." "And the milk," said Miss Marple. Not an accusation. A question, asked gently, because it needed to be asked, and because gentleness did not make it less necessary. Dorothea was quiet for a long moment. "I took it from the kitchen dairy Wednesday evening," she said. "I had Digitalin. From the Colonel's heart medication, there was an old prescription. The dosage had been changed, and the old tablets were still in the cabinet." She paused. "I told myself I only wanted him ill. Too ill to speak to anyone until I had decided what to do. I told myself it was temporary." "But you knew," said Miss Marple quietly, that in a man of his age and constitution, the dose you used was not temporary. Dorothea did not answer. She did not need to. The colonel sat down heavily in his chair. He looked at his niece, the child of his wife's family, the girl he had watched grow up in this house, whom he had trusted with its management and its daily life. And his face held something that was not anger and not forgiveness and not understanding, but the painful, necessary precursor to all three. "Clara," he said, "whatever happens to you, Dorothea, and I will not pretend I know what should, Clara must be found. She must be told. She must receive what she is owed." Dorothea nodded. "I know," she said. "I'll tell Inspector Slack everything. Tomorrow morning, if you want. Tonight, if it's necessary." She looked at Miss Marple. "I should have told the truth on Thursday. I knew it then. I wasn't ready." "No one is ever ready," said Miss Marple. "They do it anyway, or they don't. You are doing it now. That's not nothing." She rose, and she said good night to them both, and she walked back through the rain to her cottage, and she thought about Dorothea sitting in that study with the colonel and the open letters and the long work of whatever came next. The legal reckoning, the human reckoning, and the slow and non-linear process of a family confronting the shape of what it had been and deciding if it could, what it wished to become. Outside, the rain drummed steadily on. The village was dark and quiet and wet. Somewhere in Exeter, Clara Fenn was sleeping, not yet knowing that by Monday morning her name would be spoken in a police station in a village she had never heard of, in connection with a father she had been told did not remember her. Miss Marple hung up her wet coat. She made tea. She sat in her chair and looked at her garden through the dark and the rain and thought, with the tired and clear-eyed tenderness she felt for the enduring human capacity for both damage and repair, that the truth was a very strange gift, unwanted usually when it arrived, impossible afterward to imagine living without, when the Sunday morning that followed was the kind that November occasionally produces as though by accident, clear and cold and luminous. The sky a pale, washed blue that had no business being so beautiful given everything that had happened beneath it that week. The frost on Miss Marple's garden caught the early light and held it, briefly, in the way that very fragile things sometimes hold precious things. Carefully, and not for long. She had slept better than she expected. This was not callousness. She had learned, across a very long life of sitting with difficult truths, that the body's insistence on rest was not indifference to the weight of things, but a kind of wisdom. The organism's understanding that clarity requires sleep the way a lamp requires oil, and that exhaustion serves no one, least of all the people whose situations still require attending to. She was at her kitchen table with her first cup of tea when Inspector Slack knocked at her door at 8:30. He had not telephoned ahead, which was characteristic. He knocked the way he did everything, with the blunt efficiency of a man who considered preliminary courtesies an obstacle between himself and the information he required. She let him in and poured him tea without asking whether he wanted it, because he always wanted it and always pretended otherwise, and they sat across from each other in her kitchen with the Sunday morning quiet around them and the frost still holding in the garden outside the window. "Dr. Haydock's full report," he said, placing a folder on the table between them. "Came through late last night." "Digital in," said Miss Marple, and Slack looked at her with the expression she knew well, that compound of irritation and reluctant respect that she had come to regard, over the years, as his particular form of affection. "How long have you known?" "I suspected from Thursday," she said. The milk glass beside the chair, the fact that Mrs. Plotkin no longer handled the morning milk herself, the particular stillness of the body as she described it. No distress, no struggle, simply cessation. Digitalin in sufficient concentration produces exactly that presentation in a man with an already compromised heart. She paused. "I confirmed the delivery arrangement with Mrs. Plotkin on Friday morning." Dorothea Reeves. said Slack. Yes. He opened his notebook. She came to the station this morning, 7 o'clock. Herself, no solicitor, and no prompting. He said it with the slightly grudging tone of a man acknowledging something that doesn't fit comfortably into his existing framework. Gave a full statement. Everything, the papers, the milk, the letters she intercepted through Mrs. Elm. Everything. Miss Marple nodded. She was not surprised. She had seen it in Dorothea's face the previous evening, the particular resolution of someone who has finally put down a weight they had been carrying in the wrong direction and understood at last which way they actually needed to walk. She says she didn't intend to kill him, said Slack. I believe that is true, said Miss Marple carefully. I also believe she understood. At some level she was not prepared to fully examine at the time, and that the dose she administered to a man of Monkton's age and condition carried a substantial risk of exactly what occurred. The law will need to determine what to make of that distinction. It is not a simple question. No, said Slack, it isn't. He wrote something in his notebook. The will, the original one. Is there enough to act on? After 20 years with the primary parties dead. That is a matter for estate lawyers and the courts, said Miss Marple. What exists is this. The second witness Monkton mentioned, a Mrs. Vera Good of Exeter, 81 years old, has already provided a signed and witnessed statement confirming that she was present at the signing of Gerald Reeves's original will in August 1934, and that the document subsequently submitted for probate was not that document. Monkton's own written account, posted before his arrival and now in my possession, corroborates this entirely. The copies he carried in his satchel were destroyed, but copies made at the time by a frightened young clerk have a habit of existing in more than one place. She paused. I took the liberty of writing to a solicitor in London on Friday. An old acquaintance. He has agreed to look at the matter as a priority. Slack looked at her over his teacup. You've been busy. I have been thorough, said Miss Marple, with the mild precision of someone correcting a minor inaccuracy. There is a difference. She walked to the manor at 11. Not to speak to Dorothea, who was no longer there, who was, by that hour, in a police station in the next town beginning the formal process of whatever came next for her. And a process that would be long and painful and would not resolve into anything simple or clean, because the situations that produce such processes never do. She walked to the manor to speak to the colonel. He was in the garden, which surprised her. The frost had melted by then, and the ground was soft and cold, and the bare canes of the rose beds stood in their winter severity, and the colonel was moving among them with a pair of pruning shears, and the slow, deliberate attention of a man performing a task that requires just enough concentration to keep the mind from being entirely consumed by everything else. He heard her on the gravel, and turned, and when his face in the cold morning light was exhausted, and old and more honest than she had seen it in years, stripped of the particular careful composure that very old men of his generation wore as a matter of habit and breeding, and the long practice of not burdening others with the full content of their interior lives. I wrote to Clara this morning, he said, before she could speak. A proper letter. 12 pages. He said it with the slight bewilderment of a man surprised by himself. I didn't know I had 12 pages in me on the subject, but apparently I did. What did you say? Asked Miss Marple. He was quiet for a moment, turning the pruning shears slowly in his large, weathered hands. The truth, he said. All of it. What I suspected and didn't pursue. What I should have done and didn't. What her father was. The Gerald I knew, the brother, not the abstraction that Agnes made of him. He paused. I told her about the roses. Gerald loved roses. He planted half of these himself the summer before he died. I told her that. He looked at the bare canes around him. I don't know why that seemed important. It seemed important. It is important, said Miss Marple. It is perhaps the most important thing in the letter. The colonel looked at her. "She has spent 38 years believing her father forgot her," said Miss Marple quietly. "The legal question of what she is owed, the estate, the inheritance, whatever the courts decide, that is significant and it will matter to her practically. But the thing that will matter to her in the way that cannot be measured in practical terms is knowing that he thought of her, one that the will he made was made with her at the center of it, that she was not forgotten." She paused. "The roses are part of that. The brother you knew is part of that. Those 12 pages are not a legal document. They are evidence of a different and more important kind." The colonel looked back at the rose beds. "She may not want to hear from me," he said. "She may not," Miss Marple agreed. "That is her right and her decision, and it must be respected entirely. But you have done what can be done. The letter exists. The truth exists. What she chooses to make of it is hers." They stood in silence for a moment among the bare roses, the cold air around them and the pale blue sky above, and the village going about its Sunday morning below the manor walls. Bells from the church at the far end of the high street, a dog somewhere, the distant sound of a motor car. Ordinary life, continuing. As it always did, Miss Marple thought, regardless of what had happened within it during the week. Not because ordinary life was indifferent to the extraordinary, but because it was larger than any single event, and its continuation was itself a kind of answer to the things that tried to stop it. "Monkton," said the colonel. "He came all this way." "He did," said Miss Marple. 20 years late. "But he came, and he brought the truth with him, and the truth survived him. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal." The colonel nodded slowly. He looked at the rose canes. Gerald's roses, half of them planted the summer before a man died and left a daughter who needed protecting, and a brother who should have protected her and didn't, and had spent 20 years knowing it. "I'll look after Clara," he said. "Whatever the courts decide, whatever she'll allow." His jaw set with the quiet, unbending determination and of a man making a promise he intends to keep regardless of whether it is easy or convenient or welcomed. "She is Gerald's daughter. She is family. I should have found her 20 years ago." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "But you will find her now, and now is what remains." She left him in the garden with his pruning shears and his roses, and his 12-page letter already travelling toward Exeter in the Sunday post, and she walked back down the manor lane into the village, past the post office, where Mrs. Elm was beginning the long and uncomfortable process of explaining herself to the postal authorities, past the tea-room where the cornered table sat empty in the window, past Mrs. and Plotkin's boarding house, where the room at the back overlooking the garden was clean and quiet and waiting for its next occupant. She walked home. She put the kettle on. She sat in her chair by the window and picked up her knitting. The pale blue scarf for Raymond's youngest, 3 inches further along than it had been last Tuesday when all of this began. And she worked in the quiet Sunday light and thought about Edward Monkton. She thought about him walking up this same lane in the rain, carrying 20 years of silence and the courage it had finally taken to break it. She thought about the tired decision in his eyes and the careful way he had watched the lane toward the manor and the generous tip he had left in the tea-room and the 12 pages of truth he had carried in a leather satchel across England to give to people who needed it more than he needed his own peace of mind. She thought that he had been, in the end, a good man. Not a perfect one, not a brave one, not consistently, not across the whole of his life. But a man who had arrived, finally, at the understanding that the distance between what we have done and what we should have done is not fixed, that it can be walked if we are willing to walk it, regardless of how late the hour. She hoped someone would tell Clara that. She thought the colonel's letter probably did. Outside, the Sunday morning continued, bright, cold, unhurried, indifferent to murder and forgery and the long damage of old secrets in the specific way that beauty is always indifferent to ugliness, not because it doesn't coexist with it, but because it refuses to be defined by it. Miss Marple worked another inch of pale blue scarf and listened to the village breathe and felt, with the complicated quiet satisfaction of someone who has seen something terrible and something true in the same week, that St. Mary Mead would be all right. It had been all right before. Through worse things than this, and through things that were different but equally human in their capacity for both damage and repair. It would be all right again. She knitted on. The end. We are none of us only what we have done. But we are none of us free of it either. The most honest life, I've always thought. That is one that holds both of these things at the same time, without flinching from either. Miss Jane Marple, St. Mary Mead.